Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History by Podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Mark Goodacre. And today we'll be discussing his upcoming book titled The Fourth Synoptic Gospel, John's Knowledge of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So Mark, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks very much, Jacob. Always a pleasure.
And could you tell everybody a little real quick about your YouTube channel before we get started with the questions?
Yeah, sure. I've just recently launched a YouTube channel. It's got all my old audio podcasts on, but I'm beginning to upload some new videos and also lots of little shorts. So if your attention span lasts less than 3 minutes, then there's plenty of 3-minute videos on there. Oh, and it's the address is just search for me, Mark Goodacre, or the channel's name is Podacre, Podacre. Thank you.
Yeah, I have that channel tagged in the description below, and it will also be in the pinned comment after the stream. Also, the link to purchase the book will be in the description below, or pre-order the book will be in the description below, and in the live stream pinned comment and in the pinned comment below that.
Cool.
So, Mark, why call it the Fourth Synoptic Gospel?
Well, in some respects, it's a question for my publisher, not me, because I was going to call the book Fourth Gospel without the, so that people could read John's Gospel as being fourth in the canon after the other three. I thought that was kind of clever. But then I had a conversation with Ehrman, who are publishing it, and they said, do you know what? We really like one of your chapter titles. And I'd called chapter 2, The Fourth Synoptic Gospel. And they said, can we call the whole book that? And I was like, okay, sure. So if anyone pushes back on it, then I could just blame my publisher. Got to that stage in my career where I can actually blame my publisher for things.
But in any case, why call it the Fourth Synoptic Gospel? What makes it the fourth?
Yes, excellent question. My first answer was somewhat facetious, so this is the real answer to that question. It's a really straightforward thing, which is that if you open up a synopsis of the Gospels, like the one which everybody uses, for those that are not familiar with a synopsis of the Gospels, you lay Matthew, Mark, and Luke alongside one another in parallel columns. Now, if you pick up the most popular Greek and English synopsis of the Gospels, do you know what it's called? It's called Synopsis of the Four Gospels. And when I was writing this book, I found that every day I was consulting that synopsis of the Four Gospels. And the reason why it's called Synopsis of the Four Gospels is John's Gospel can frequently be put alongside the Synoptic Gospels and compared with them. So my thinking is, lots of the time, John is synoptic. You can look at John alongside Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And here's one really interesting wrinkle on that. Sometimes John is closer to Matthew and Mark than Luke is to Matthew and Mark, and so on. So sometimes John plays the role of like a third synoptic gospel. But of course, when you're putting it alongside the others, we'll call it the fourth synoptic gospel. So that's really where the concept comes from.
And other times where also John will agree with Luke against Matthew and Mark.
Yes, and this is perhaps the most fascinating question when you're looking at the four Gospels together, that John has these fascinating agreements with Luke. Sometimes they're just small things. So when you get the Last Supper in John's Gospel, John says that Satan entered into Judas Iscariot. Now, this is just the same in Luke's Gospel in Luke 22, Satan entering into Judas Iscariot. And there's a couple of explanations for that. One explanation would be that both of them somehow got it out of oral tradition. New Testament scholars love oral tradition. Another much better explanation is that one of the two authors knows the other one, or the other one's book. And in my opinion, it's John knowing Luke. And the reason why I think I can be reasonably confident about that is that when you look at the characteristic language in some of those agreements, like this one about Satan entering Judas, they're more characteristic of Luke than they are of John. So that is the only place in John's Gospel where you see the devil being called Satan. John prefers to call him the devil. So it's little things like that. And Luke loves calling the devil Satan. So it's little things like that that suggest that the direction of influence is from Luke to John. There's all sorts of other interesting similarities. I mean, Martha and Mary, we meet in Luke's Gospel in chapter 10, and then they turn up in John's Gospel in chapters 11 and 12. So you even get these sort of parallel characters that we haven't heard of in Matthew and Mark.
And other times when John is closer to Mark than he is with Matthew and Luke.
Yes, very much so. So one of the most fascinating aspects of this whole problem is that sometimes John is really close to Mark. It's striking because, I mean, I actually began when I was doing this project thinking, could we actually take Mark out of the equation? Could it be that by the time John's writing, Matthew and Luke are so popular that John can access that Markan material through Matthew and Luke? And the answer is no. You frequently get really close agreements between John and Mark. So let's go back to the question of the anointing of Jesus. In John's Gospel, it's in chapter 12, and it's Mary that anoints Jesus. In Matthew, it's in 26, and in Mark, it's in chapter 14. Now, the thing about the anointing is that when the woman opens this pistic nard, you get this line, this could have been sold for 300 denarii. And then John has the same thing. This could have been sold for 300 denarii. And I thought, okay, is 300 denarii, is that like a kind of, is that like an ancient world way of saying a ton of money? $1 million, 64,000. Is it a set thing? So I went searching for denarii amounts. And do you know what? The first occurrences in Greek literature of that specific amount of money that we know of is in Mark's Gospel there and his anointing, and John's Gospel and his anointing. So things like, and when we remember as well that the denarius as a kind of money, the denarius wasn't actually especially common in Galilee and Judea in this period. It's a kind of Roman coinage, and hardly any denarii have actually even been found in Judea or in Galilee. So I'm grateful to my good friend Mark at Southern Methodist University for this point. But yeah, the links are striking, and sometimes the devil is in the detail.
And isn't there that occasion in John where he talks about Jesus healing a blind man with spittle, just like in the Gospel of Mark?
Yes, I mean, Matthew and Luke really don't like physical agents of healing. They don't like mentioning saliva and things like this. But John, quite happy in John 9, when Jesus heals the man born blind, he does actually rub spittle. In John's Gospel, he gets the spit and makes that kind of clay and puts clay in the man's eyes. And in Mark's Gospel, when he heals the blind man of Bethsaida, yeah, he heals him with spittle. So yes, fascinating little links like that.
And there are times in John where that he'll agree with Luke about removing repetitive miracles, like with the feeding. That one feeding of only the feeding of the 5,000. We don't need the feeding of the 4,000. The point's already made.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. I mean, so Luke isn't going to have two feedings. I mean, even as a child, I remember going to church and hearing the story of the feeding of the 4,000, and thinking, well, hold on a minute, isn't it the 5,000? And if there's a story of the 4,000, it sounds like exactly the same story, just with the numbers changed. And I think, Luke's looking at Matthew and Mark and thinking that, and John does the same. John's not going to have a second feeding story. In fact, what John does is he's even more selective than Luke. John is really selective. I mean, he instead of having a whole ton of miracle stories, he has just the 7 signs, specially selected so that you can draw out some element of about Jesus, that they're all Christological. So when you get to John's story of the feeding of the 5,000, he uses that to develop his idea of I am the bread of life. And lots of those miracle stories that he could have used it from the Synoptic Gospels. He doesn't, because he wants to pick ones that will really help him to zone in on some particular element in Jesus's identity. And of course, the bread of life fits perfectly when you've just told the story about the feeding of the 5,000.
Are there times when John will also copy Matthew's accounts of the miracles?
Yes and no. There's less evidence of John using Matthew's miracle stories, but there are evidences of John using some of Matthew's wording in other stories. Two of the longest verbatim agreements between John and any of the synoptics occur with Matthew. One of them is the confession, "You are the Christ, the Son of God." That comes in Matthew 16 in Simon Peter's mouth. It's slightly differently worded in Mark and Luke. And John has exactly the same 8 words in Greek in that same string, but in Martha's mouth in John chapter 11. "You are the Christ, the Son of God." So yes, you get these interesting Mattheanisms finding their way into John's gospel as well. I drew a little on my friend and colleague James Barker's work there, because his first book was about John's use of Matthew's gospel, and a lot of people that believe that John has close links with the synoptics have struggled to see John having links with Matthew, but I'm a little different from that. I think especially Matthew's Christology is the thing that has an impact on John's gospel.
And even that the extra chapter, John 21, seems to make a little bit of use of Matthew about the way it talks about Simon, the son of Jonah, and he's now Simon, the son of John.
Yes, great point. Yeah. And in fact, we would never have known that Simon had a dad called Jonah or John if it wasn't for Matthew and John. Yeah. I mean, it is strange how he doesn't retain the son of Jonah. I mean, we know why Matthew likes the idea of Simon, son of Jonah, because he's interested in the character of Jonah. No sign will be given to this generation except the sign of Jonah you get in Matthew. But yes, that slight change from Jonah to John, that's a good link too. But also John 21 has lots of similarities with Luke chapter 5. So Luke has a miraculous haul of fish earlier in his gospel, and John then has this similar haul of fish, but right at the end, and he uses it again for Christological purposes, showing who Jesus is and reflecting on the nature of Jesus as a shepherd and as a fisher of people.
And you also showed another parallel between John and Matthew and Mark when it talks about the person that was healed of a fever, the fever leaving him, but in Matthew and Mark it's her, but John it's him.
Yeah, this is a lovely example, so what happens is in Matthew's gospel in chapter 8 you have the story of the healing of the centurion's boy, and in Matthew, that's not in Mark's gospel. Straight after the centurion's boy healing, you get the healing of Peter's mother-in-law, which Matthew's pulled from Mark chapter 1. What's so interesting in John is in John 4, where you have the healing of the officer's son, which is very, very similar to the centurion's boy in Matthew, which again is also in Luke, but it's very similar to that. And the line you get in the piece which is just next to it, Peter's mother-in-law, the fever left her, is just the same phrasing, but just with her changed to him, as you said, in John's gospel. It's one of those things which is interesting, because you always get people saying, well, maybe John just got this from the same tradition as Matthew. But this isn't about traditions. This is about literary ordering. You actually have to see the centurion's boy and the healing of Peter's mother-in-law next to it in Matthew's gospel, then note that it comes over into John. The fun thing about that example, it actually came into my book really late in the day, because I came across an article by my old doctoral supervisor, John Muddyman, which if I'd ever read it, I'd forgotten about it. And it was about an idea that Austin Farah had for John's use of Matthew, which he'd written on the back of an envelope. And Muddyman published what Austin Farah had put on the back of an envelope. And I read it, and it included this example. And I thought, and I love Austin Farah. Some people will know that the hypothesis of the formation of the Gospels that I adhere to is called the Farah Theory, after Austin Farah. So I found that example in Austin Farah. It's a brilliant observation. Yeah.
Does John also saying that if everything were recorded of Jesus, there would be enough room in the world for all the books recording everything that he said and did? Does that kind of remind you of Luke saying that he used many sources, but it's much more elaborated, that there's so much there's not enough room out there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, John's gospel ends with this note that if you kept on writing about everything that Jesus did, the whole world, wouldn't be able to contain everything. And Luke shows a very similar self-consciousness at the beginning of Luke's gospel about many who have set down things in writing. Luke might be exaggerating there. I mean, he might only have Matthew and Mark, in my opinion, but Luke does like to kind of exaggerate a little bit. But yeah, absolutely. And again, it shows that same principle of selectivity. A lot of people don't realize that all four Gospels in the canon and many non-canonical Gospels are self-consciously selective. They talk about their selectivity. They say Jesus did tons of things, but we're just going to choose these particular ones because these ones will actually help you to see who Jesus is. So they're all doing that to some extent, but John has mastered the art. And he even says that what he's done, that the reason he's chosen the signs that he's chosen is so that you may know that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. And there you see that same pairing that we were talking about before of Christ, Son of God, that you get in Matthew's Gospel's confession of Peter. So John quite keen on that kind of pairing there. And yeah, the principle of selectivity right there through the Synoptic Gospels, but even stronger in John's Gospel. He chooses what he thinks will help people to grasp who Jesus is.
And what do you make of the character Joseph of Arimathea and the way he's portrayed in John in relation to John's use of Matthew and Mark?
It's kind of fascinating. I suppose the big thing that is different in John's Gospel is that he adds the character of Nicodemus. So Nicodemus is at the tomb with Joseph of Arimathea. And Nicodemus has been a character we've seen earlier in John's Gospel, in chapter 3, most famously, when he talks to Jesus and Jesus says that you must be born from above. So you get this new character of Nicodemus coming in. So you get this kind of nice kind of continuity of characters in John. But there's another really fun thing there, which is actually another link with Matthew's Gospel, because in John's Gospel, we get the notion that Joseph of Arimathea was a disciple of Jesus. Now, the only synoptic gospel to mention that Joseph of Arimathea was a disciple of Jesus is Matthew's Gospel. And Matthew says that, he was a disciple of Jesus. And I think that what's happened there is John has picked up the detail from Matthew. Again, I don't think oral tradition helps us to explain these types of things because they're just small literary expansions that Matthew is making to Mark and then that John seems to have knowledge of.
What do you make of the original, the classical idea of okay, so John has few parallels to the synoptics, but the majority of the gospel is unique. It's so different. That's why it's so difficult to show knowledge of the synoptics or vice versa. What do you make of that old paradigm?
Yeah, because people say this a great deal, and that John is just so different. And if John is just so different, how can John have known the synoptics? And my take on that, well, first take is it's not that different, right? It's not that different. When you look at the way that John's Gospel is structured, what you have is an entire structural parallel. So you begin with John the Baptist, you then have Jesus beginning his ministry in Galilee, you have trips to Jerusalem, and you ultimately have this extended passion narrative and resurrection story. And the particular bits of there are particular bits in John that actually map onto the same particular bits that we get in Mark's Gospel. So, for example, the triumphal entry in John's Gospel comes at roughly the same place proportionally in John as it comes in Mark. So that's one thing. They are quite similar. But even if people were right that they are just so different from one another, I think what we have to remind ourselves is the way that you diagnose a literary connection isn't by looking at what's different, it's by looking at what's the same. So no plagiarist can get away with saying, look at all the bits that I didn't plagiarize. That's not a good argument. If you are charged with plagiarism, if you've used somebody else's work, you can't say, yeah, but I didn't use their work here, here, and here. Even if you've only plagiarized 20% of someone's work, you've still plagiarized it. So one of the things I think we have to remember is it's similarities that diagnose literary contact, not differences. The differences are always going to be there because otherwise you're not actually writing a new book at all. You're simply making a version of the old book. So you're always going to have differences.
And what do you make of John's treatment of the tomb narrative of Jesus in relations to Matthew and Mark?
It's one of the things I've thought about the most is the story of the tomb in all four canonical gospels. In fact, I wrote an article a few years ago called "How Empty Was the Tomb," in which I argued that when you look at the tomb narratives against what we know of Jerusalem tombs in the first century, it actually sheds light on the gospel narratives and what they're actually describing. John does something very interesting in chapter 20. He still has what's recognizably the same story that you get in the Synoptics, but he reduces the characters at the beginning of John 20 to just one. He has Mary Magdalene. Now, Mary Magdalene features in Matthew, Mark, and Luke at this point, but she always appears with other women. The names of the women differ, but she's always there with the other women. And so lots of people say, oh, well, it's just one woman there in John. But do you know what? In verse 2, you get the line, they have taken away our Lord, and we do not know where they've laid him. So even though we only have Mary Magdalene as the main character in this story, she's still apparently with a couple of other people. Now, some people think John might have written that by accident, like a kind of, written it by fatigue or whatever. But I think it's intentionally presupposing the story that you find in the Synoptics. So often what happens in John is he goes, I'm going to presuppose this synoptic story, and then I'm going to build on it. John's gospel just makes loads more sense when you see him presupposing the narratives of the other three canonical gospels. And in fact, one of the chapters in the book is all about how John presupposes other people's narratives. Other scholars have written about this across the decades. So one of them, Margaret Davis, in a book called Rhetoric and the Fourth Gospel, she actually points out that John will often presuppose stuff that you find in Mark's gospel, and to some extent the other synoptics as well. But what I did is I tried to sort of develop that into a whole fresh argument for John's knowledge of the synoptics. And so many of the examples, I think, make much, much better sense when you see John as presupposing narratives that he's not actually himself narrating. He expects the readers to know the narratives.
Could you tell us a bit about go into my brothers in Matthew and John?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in the resurrection story, again, same story where Jesus is addressing Mary Magdalene. He says to her, go and tell my brothers about what's happened. Now, the interesting thing is, the other gospel who uses the term brothers at this point is Matthew's gospel at exactly the same point. Now, is that the kind of thing that John could have written on his own? Well, maybe. But what you have to say is, when you see exactly the same difference from Mark and Luke appearing at Matthew and John, exactly the same point, you then have to say, well, could it be that John's got it off Matthew? And one of the issues there is that Matthew really loves that language of family. Who is my mother? Who are my brothers? Like, basically, the family of Jesus are not the blood relations. They're people that do God's will. And throughout Matthew's gospel, it's there in Mark and Luke, that whole family idea. People used to call it fictive kinship. I don't like the term fictive kinship because the whole point of the language is that this is a real family member, not a fictional one. But anyway, that whole idea of family is key in Matthew's gospel. John doesn't like that language as much usually. In John's gospel, he doesn't go so much for the sort of brother-sister language. He tends to go a bit more for friendship language. So Jesus as people's friend. No greater love has anyone than that they should die for their friends. So that's how John tends to see things. So I think what's happened there is a little detail in Matthew has found its way into John.
So now I want to ask about the double crucify and freefold declaration of innocence and the connection with Mark, Luke, and John there.
Yeah, sure. So this was another. It's interesting you pick this one out as something, because this was something that came to me quite late in the process. I'd got so in, is it my chapter 3? I think it's in my chapter 3. I do a thing which I call John from Mark via Matthew and Luke, and so I try and show how when Matthew and Luke rephrase elements in Mark, John often takes over that rephrasing, and sometimes even little structural things happen. And I had lots of examples of this, but I wanted one that wasn't simply, when we're looking at John's parallels with Luke, I wanted one that wasn't just an added word or an added phrase. I wanted something that was a little bit more like a kind of parallel literary restructuring. And I'd had in my notes for ages, keep looking at the child. There's something there. I had a hunch there was something there. And I don't think I've seen anyone else point this out. People have pointed out there's a parallel between John and Luke, and the parallel is Jesus has the double, Pontius Pilate has the double crucify him, crucify him. That's unique to Luke and John. So people have pointed that out, obviously. But also, 3 times you get Pilate saying to the people, I find no cause for this person's execution, or I find no reason to put him to death. 3 times you have that. I kept staring at it and staring at it. I think there's definitely something here. And really late in the process, I went back to our old friend TLG, the system that enables you to look through Greek literature. I thought, I find no cause of evil. I find nothing wrong in this man. I've seen that before. I've seen it all over Luke's Gospel and Acts. Luke always has things about finding in those forensic contexts. And I thought, does John ever have those? No. John only uses that word find, heurisko in Greek. And I can't help doing a bit of a corny joke. You know, the term eureka, which means I have found it. That is literally from the same Greek word. And this was a real eureka moment for me when I found this, because I went to TLG and I looked for, this as a kind of interesting feature, and like you could see, wham, loads of it in Luke and in Acts, but only there in John, in spite of that John loves law court metaphors and things like that. So crucify, and then I find no wrong in him 3 times. Those things are parallel in Luke and John. And I think it's a case of John taking over Luke's distinctive literary structuring and preferred way of saying things. So I kind of liked that example. Maybe I just like it because I can say eureka, but I do like that example, yeah. And I suppose I like it all the more. You always have a special pleasure if you find something you've not seen anyone else. And I'm not saying no one else has seen it before. I will, even if I read on John's Gospel for the rest of my life, if I spent the next, 20 or 30 years reading books about John's Gospel, I still wouldn't scrape the barrel. I still wouldn't, not scrape the barrel, I still wouldn't kind of get the surface level of the reading of. So someone may have said this before, but if they have, I haven't found it.
Do you see any evidence of John's use of acts?
Yes, but there's nothing much that I talk about in the book at all. I mean, I use acts as a way of helping us to see things that are distinctive of Luke's voice, but I don't think there's really close connections with acts. I mean, there is when Jesus appears before the high priest in John's Gospel. It does sound kind of reminiscent of when Paul is being interrogated in Acts, and there are little things, but I actually stayed off that topic as being, sometimes you have to be strategic when you write a book. You don't want it to be. I certainly don't want it to be too long. I comment in the preface that I don't really like writing long books, and to be absolutely honest, I don't like reading them either. So why should I inflict those on my readers? So I think there has to be a certain selectivity and a certain strategy in writing. See, it's not actually that thing. It's not huge.
So what about that verse in John where it says, "After these things, Jesus went to the other side of Galilee, of the Galilee of Tiberias."
Hmm. Yeah, that's one of my favorite examples. So for those that are not very familiar with this example, it's at the beginning of John chapter 6, and basically you get this line that Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, brackets of Tiberias. It's already quite interesting that he's using the term Sea of Galilee. We don't notice things like that because we're familiar with the term Sea of Galilee. If you actually go and visit Galilee today, you will actually see signs saying Sea of Galilee. That is quite possibly because of Mark's gospel. He's the first one that we know of in history that called it that. The Sea of Galilee. What other people called it was Lake Gennesaret, or Lake Gennesaret. So that's already quite kind of interesting. That's a point made by Eugene Boring. Now, there's something else there, though, that I found fascinating, which is that the other side of the Sea of Galilee. Hold on a minute. This is the first time Sea of Galilee has been mentioned in John's Gospel. So how come we're suddenly on the other side? Well, lots of people see that strange aporia, that strange kind of seam in the text. And lots of people think, oh, well, John 6 must have got mixed up with John 5, because then you've got the end of chapter 4, which is the thing with the officer's son in Galilee, where Cana and Capernaum get mentioned. You could then have that, and then if chapter 6 follows it, then it's Jesus goes to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. And then if chapter 5 comes after all of that, then Jesus has gone back to Jerusalem again. But you don't need any of those dislocation theories because they're all purely hypothetical. There's no instant that we haven't got a text of John's Gospel that's got chapter 6 before chapter 5. So it's always preferable to think of an explanation that actually makes better sense of the Gospel as we have it. And one of the things about John's Gospel is it has these places where John seems to presuppose the synoptic narrative. And so all along, it turns out, John knows about the Sea of Galilee. He knows that Capernaum is on this side of the Sea of Galilee, as Mark's writing. And Mark is the one who then says Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. So John, it turns out, is presupposing not just the synoptic gospels, but even the synoptic geography. He doesn't need to narrate it. It doesn't need to say, and because it doesn't make any sense to say the other side of something if you've not mentioned this side of it. So, and this side, the side that's got Capernaum on it, that is the default setting of lots of synoptic gospel accounts, especially Mark's gospel accounts. So yeah, I love that example. Other people have pointed this out in the past. That's a good example of one that other people have pointed out, but haven't really seen its potential to show the direction of dependence as going from the synoptics to John, and not the reverse, and not kind of oral traditions or signs gospels and so on.
What do you make of the village of Mary and her sister Martha?
Yes, that's another good one. This is something that one of the things I loved early on in the project, because I was working on this off and on for the best part of 10 years, which sounds ridiculous for a 200-page book. But, life got in the way, and the day job got in the way, especially doing things like chairing a department and things like that. But the thing that I really enjoyed when I started work on this project was something I always do when I start on a new project. I just go back and I read classics, stuff that I know I've read before, but that I really want to read again. And in this case, the classic, which is now over 100 years old, was B.H. Streeter, Canon B.H. Streeter's The Four Gospels. And I'd read that over and over again in the past because of what it does with the synoptic gospels. And I frequently refer to Streeter in my book on Q, The Case Against Q. But I knew that Streeter was similar to me on the question of John, because Streeter thought that John knew Mark and Luke. And he has this as an example for the direction of dependence being from Luke to John. Because when John introduces a new character, Lazarus, in John chapter 11, he says that he was a certain man, tis in the Greek, a certain man who lived in Bethany, which is the village of Mary and Martha. Now, it's an easy to miss point, but the way that he introduces Lazarus is as a new character. Tis, a certain person. That's what John does when he introduces a new character. He'll go, there was a certain guy. It was a certain woman. But then when he says Mary and Martha, he doesn't say, and he lived in Bethany, which was where a certain woman, Mary, lived with her sister Martha. He doesn't say that. John expects the reader to know who Mary and Martha are. And the only sense that I can make of that is that John is presupposing Luke 10, 38 to 42, the story of Mary and Martha. And if you think about it for a moment, the story that John's about to tell is the story of a man being raised from the dead who's been in the tomb for 4 days. So if John were developing this out of oral tradition, it'd be kind of strange that the readers know about Mary and Martha, who are a couple of Jesus' friends, but they've never heard of Lazarus before, who is this guy who's been raised from the dead. So, yeah, I think it's a good case. Streeter had a really good case there, and it was so nice being able to be friendly towards Streeter, having been mean to him in my case against Q. So yeah, and I found that several other people made this same point. I don't think the point has ever been adequately answered by people that believe that Luke knew John or that both were independent from one another. It's really good evidence for John's familiarity with Luke, in my opinion.
And what do you make of arguments that attempt to say that John's a layered gospel and Luke or Matthew may have known older editions of John? When you look at John's use of them, in what way does it explain the data better that John looks like it's multi-stage, but it's not, because John was just making use of the synoptics? That may have made some people, given people the mistaken impression it was multi-layered text.
Yeah, I mean, there's a sort of, I suppose there's a larger, more general answer to this, and then there's a more specific answer. But let me do the larger answer. I'm not a big fan of multi-layered hypotheses and of old editions and all this kind of thing. One of the reasons is I kind of suspect that it comes from our nature as textual scholars, where we're actually frustrated archaeologists, that we really want to be digging and finding new information. And so we kind of imagine our text like an archaeological tell that we can dig into. And that's why, so I have this general suspicion of people that do the layering and the additions. And also, if John had gone through multiple layers, multiple editions, I'm struck by the fact that every reconstruction is different. If it was so overwhelmingly obvious that John had gone through a series of editions or a series of layers, whatever, we should be able to see the same reconstruction, and we don't. They all differ. That's the sort of my general skepticism about those type of approaches. But what I'd throw in addition to that is that a lot of the places where people go to try and prove that John is like multi-layered, or they can see aporias or seams or whatever, they're places that are better explained by John's knowledge of the synoptics. So the example we were just talking about, a lot of people see a big seam at the end of John 5 and the beginning of John 6. They say John 6 doesn't make sense coming after John 5 because he's going to the other side of the Sea of Galilee and he's just been in Jerusalem. But for me, it makes perfect sense because John is just picking up on the Synoptic Gospels and presupposing their narratives. There's another fun one at the end of John 14. There's a place where Jesus says, "Come now, let us leave." And then the very next line is, "I am the true vine and my Father is the gardener." So he doesn't seem to have left at all. He keeps on talking for another couple of chapters before they actually do leave. Well, the interesting thing is that phrase, "Come now, let us leave," is found in Mark's Gospel. It's found in Mark 14. So I think there, again, where you see one of these apparent seams, one of these aporias, it's something that's explained by John's familiarity with the synoptics.
What do you make of that saying, "You will be scattered," in John?
Yeah, well, yes, you have that. So in the synoptics, you have the line about the disciples all being scattered, and you get the image of them being like sheep without a shepherd. And sorry, no, it's not a sheep that's shepherd. Sorry, that is no, and it is strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. The interesting thing is that that's not actually narrated in John, the disciples scattering, but he does presuppose that it's going to happen because he actually does talk about them being scattered in a kind of in a prophetic way. So again, you do see John presupposing a nice synoptic detail.
And what about that saying in John where it says, I will rebuild this temple, the shortest temple I will rebuild it in 3 days? And is
Mhm.
it trying to like create like a prequel saying to Jesus to explain the Gospels quoting him and referring to it backwards?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I mean, yes, in the synoptics, we get the false witnesses at Jesus's trial saying that they'd heard him saying that he was going to take this temple made with hands and destroy it, and then another one was going to be built up, not made with hands. And then something very similar to that is actually put in Jesus's mouth in John chapter 2. And it does, if you read John 2 and then imagine yourself to the synoptic trial stories, you actually do see John is kind of anticipating something that's going to happen later, because they don't quite quote it the same way. It's not exactly the same. So if you've read John's gospel, it actually enriches your understanding of the synoptics there. But yes, I think he's created a kind of prequel. That's a nice. I don't think that's an expression that I use in this context, but I like that. Yeah, it almost produces a prequel to something that the synoptics are going to be narrating later on.
What do you make of John's treatment of Jesus's brothers in comparison to the synoptics?
Well, the treatment of Jesus's like physical family, biological family in all four canonical gospels is kind of fascinating. We know that they must have been a major part of the early Christian movement because, we get reference to the brothers of Jesus in 1 Corinthians 9. We get reference to James, the brother of Jesus, a couple more times in Paul's epistles, most famously in Galatians 1 and 2. So it's kind of fascinating that, characters that were clearly so important in the early Christian community are played down in the Synoptics and John. And John is like the Synoptics in that front. He doesn't name any of the brothers, but he does call them his brothers in chapter 7. And Jesus' brothers are giving him a hard time because they want him to show himself in public. But in John's gospel, Jesus frequently hides himself. It's his parallel, I think, to the kind of messianic secret motif in Mark's gospel. Jesus frequently hides himself in John. And what then happens is Jesus goes, I'm not coming out in public now. And he hides himself. And then he goes to Jerusalem secretly. So John does carry on that slightly skeptical view of the family of Jesus. The one interesting contrast, though, you'd have to draw attention to is that John does have a reasonably positive depiction of the mother of Jesus. He never calls her Mary, doesn't call her by name, but he has the mother of Jesus appearing at the wedding at Cana, right, the very first sign in John 2. And he has her reappearing at the cross alongside two other Marys, Mary Magdalene and Mary of Clopas. So we do have to say that there's this something more positive there. And you then get a kind of interesting replacement where, as Jesus dies, he says to his mother, behold your son, talking about the beloved disciple, and to the beloved disciple, behold your mother. So you get there the integration of the biological family with the metaphorical family of Jesus. So there is some positivity there that kind of trumps a little bit what you get in Matthew and Mark, where usually the family are negative. Luke's already pushing in that direction. We have a very sympathetic portrait of Mary, of course, in Luke's birth story.
What do you make of John talking about teaching in the synagogues and temple? And my second part of the question is, it's stating that then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest.
Yeah, this is another case of John presupposing a synoptic narrative, in that there's this line that basically Jesus has been teaching in the synagogues, plural, and the temple. Well, the only synagogue teaching in the whole of John's gospel is in chapter 6. It's just one line. It mentions that Jesus was saying these things while he was in the synagogue at Capernaum. So it wasn't actually synagogues, plural, in John's gospel. So he must be presupposing a narrative like the one that you find in the synoptics, where Jesus is frequently in the synagogue and in different kind of synagogues. So that line is another interesting presupposition from where John is presupposing something in the Synoptics. The Annas and Caiaphas stuff, I really struggled with, because John is frequently a really sublime writer. Sometimes you read John's Gospel and it really soars. You think, gosh, that's beautifully expressed. That's really clever. But then every now and then, the prose just seems to fall in on itself. And that's one of those cases where it does. Because we seem to have John saying simultaneously that Annas was the high priest and that Caiaphas was the high priest. Now, one explanation for this, I bother me very, because it's not clearly written in John, but one explanation for this, I think, is that Luke describes Annas and Caiaphas as being high priests. He says in chapter 3, during the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas. So Luke does make them a kind of dual entity. And if you combine that with, we do this kind of silly thing in English, where if it's one high priest, we say high priest. And if it's two high priests, we translate it chief priests, but they're exactly the same term in Greek. And in fact, all three synoptic gospels use that term, high priests, chief priests, regularly in their narrative. And I think what John is doing, I think he's reading that and thinking, okay, we've got these two chief priests, Annas and Caiaphas, which will be corroborated if you also knew Luke 3. I know that sounds terribly convoluted, but at least when you're looking at John alongside the Synoptics, you can make sense of one of these passages, which is just really strange in John. And you don't actually ever get a trial before Caiaphas. Again, I think John's presupposed that. He knows you've read that in the Synoptic, so he's adding something fresh to it.
What do you make of the beloved disciple? Who is that supposed to be?
I'm tempted to say, if I was like a proper author, I would actually kind of evade the question so that people would buy the book. But what I would say about that is that so many things have been written on the beloved disciple over the years. I mean, you fall over yourself for stuff written about the beloved disciple, and of course you do, because it's just such a fascinating mystery. So I had a dilemma in writing this book. The first thing is, I had to have something on the beloved disciple, right? Got to have something on the beloved disciple. But equally, what intelligent thing could I say about unintelligent thing could I say about the beloved disciple that hasn't already been said, because so much been written on? And I was worrying about this. And suddenly it occurred to me that no one had ever written a piece on the beloved disciple for readers of the Synoptics. In other words, if you're reading John's Gospel, but you know the Synoptics, does that change the way you read the figure of the beloved disciple? So I imagined myself into the mindset of someone in the 2nd century, let's say, who knows Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and who is now reading or hearing John. How does that hearer imagine the beloved disciple? And every time I asked myself the question, I thought to myself, they would have thought it's John. They would have thought it's John, son of Zebedee. That's the obvious deduction to make if you're familiar with the Synoptics. And that then led me to, well, if that's how most readers would have read it, is it how most readers have read it? And you know what? Across 2 millennia almost, who do people think the beloved disciple is? Most people? Not as crazy, academics, but, normal people. They think it's John, son of Zebedee. And then you have to say to yourself, well, okay, if John knew the Synoptics himself, as I've been arguing in the book, and if he expected his readers to know the Synoptics, then when you're talking about the beloved disciple, you're giving people a clear invitation to see him as being John, son of Zebedee. So in a nutshell, that's what my chapter 6, the beloved disciple, for readers of the Synoptics is about. It's doing a thought experiment then going to the reception history of John, and then going to, well, if John knew the synoptics, then has he actually invited the reader to make that association? And I think he has. I think he's invited the reader to make that connection that it is John, the son of Zebedee, after all. It's actually probably the most conservative conclusion that I've ever kind of argued for. So so it was going to maybe it'll shock quite a few people. I don't know, but I honestly think that's what's going on in John.
Do you think part of that agenda was that the author of John's Gospel was using John the son of Zebedee as a beloved disciple to kind of like backdate the text? Like most of what I'm talking about here goes back to the beloved disciple.
Yeah, I mean, you've always got a problem. See, I think John is a later gospel. I think it's probably from the early 2nd century. And you've always got a problem if you're producing a fresh work of legitimacy. You see the same thing happening in the Gospel of Thomas, for example, where I think the Gospel of Thomas is I think it's later than John. I think it's written towards the middle of the 1st century. And then any listener is going to say, well, how do you know all this stuff? And, you say, oh, well, this is the secret teachings that were given to Didymus, Judas, Thomas. And so that's what Gospel of Thomas does. Gospel of Peter does something similar, and it has these as the eyewitness details of that have been remembered by Peter. And really what I think John is doing in a more subtle way, it's basically saying that he was there. It's a way of saying this will give my narrative plausibility and connection to the events. I think John does that in a variety of other ways as well. I mean, one thing that I don't discuss in the book is the fascinating use of the present tense in John 5:2, where he says, there is a pool, it's the pool of Bethzatha, which has 5 porticos. And he uses the present tense there, I think, in a kind of pseudepigraphic way. Like I call it a pseudepigraphical present, because what he's basically doing is he's providing the reader with the romantic idea that this text that you're reading is present in the 1st century. It's a subtle way that John does it. It's much more subtle in the way that the Gospel of Thomas or Peter or Proto-Evangelium of James or some of these other texts do it. But nevertheless, I think it's there. It's trying to say, this stuff is real, folks. And the genius of John's Gospel is that so many of the details are actually accurate. Like when you're looking at some of the geography and so on, I mean, he's not just making these random places and things up. We actually know that lots of these places existed. So he's got this quite interesting grasp on Palestinian/Israeli geography.
By the way, when you said Thomas was mid 1st century, did you mean mid 2nd century?
I meant mid 2nd century. I didn't notice I said that. Thank you for yes,
no problem.
That's the antithesis of what I think. The first, sorry. Yeah. I mean, it's also set. Yeah, I think it's written. I argued in my book Thomas and the Gospels that I had a whole chapter on dating, which also dates Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as well. So it's about dating of all 5 of those Gospels. But yes, I argue there that it's written after the Bar Kokhba War in 135.
What do you make of John's treatment of the voice crying in the wilderness, and in contrast to Mark?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you have this detail in Mark where Mark quotes right at the beginning of the Gospel from Isaiah 40, a voice crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. And he makes that John the Baptist, that voice in the wilderness. What's fascinating when you get to John's Gospel, you have the same line about a voice in the wilderness, but now it's not in the narrator's voice anymore. It's in the voice of John the Baptist. He says, I am a voice in the wilderness. And I argue in the book that this is typical of something that John frequently does, which is he makes dramatic adjustments to synoptic narration. I call it John's dramatic transformation of the synoptic. So he'll take a piece of narration, a voice crying in the wilderness, but he'll put it into the characters' voices. One of the things that made me realize that good dramatists do this was watching Jesus films, where you frequently get this feature, because if you're making a film on Jesus, you really don't want to have Orson Welles doing a kind of august narration in the background like you have in King of Kings. What you really want to have is you want the narrators not narrator. You want the characters to be doing the actual narration. So what frequently happens is that you get narrative material from the Gospels put into the mouths of characters, and I noticed that John does that. So in the feeding of the 5,000 in Mark's gospel, you get the line, "They all ate and were satisfied." And in John's gospel, lo and behold, Jesus says to them, "You all ate and were satisfied." So you get narrator's speech moved into the character's voice. So that I think it explains a lot of John's really interesting dramatic changes to the synoptic gospels.
And what do you make about John's treatment of John the Baptist and John saying that he witnessed the Spirit descending as a dove?
It's a great example of the same thing, I think, because in all three synoptic gospels, you get the line that the Spirit descended on Jesus like a dove. Now, that's not narrated in John, but lo and behold, it comes on John's lips. So John the Baptist says, "I saw the Spirit descending like a dove." So same thing, you get moved into character speech. And in the same incident, you have another example of John presupposing synoptic narrative, because John famously doesn't narrate Jesus's baptism, but we know he knows it happened because we've got this story about the dove descending on Jesus. So he presupposes that story, but just homes in on the one detail that he wants to focus on, which is the dove descending.
And what do you make of John's treatment of Peter when Peter and his companions weighed down with sleep?
It's a tough one, the treatment of Peter. I mean, overall, John's treatment of Peter is at times a little more sympathetic than his treatment is in the synoptics. And then at the same time, John takes away from him the big confession, as I was mentioning earlier, and gives it to Martha. So in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's Peter that identifies Jesus as Christ, and in John's gospel, it's Martha. Now, there's a whole bunch of other fascinating bits and pieces here, and again, I think you can see places where Peter's story is presupposed from the synoptic gospels. That there's a place at Jesus' arrest where Peter has chopped off the high priest servant's ear, whom John calls Malchus, and Jesus basically says, "Put away your sword," and all of this. And then he says, "Don't I have to drink the cup that's been given to me?" Now, what's fascinating about Jesus saying that is John hasn't narrated the story where Jesus decides that he must drink the cup that the Father has given to him, because that's the previous story in the synoptics. In the synoptic gospels, Jesus begs God to take this cup away from him, but then eventually accepts that God's will be done. So John presupposes that Gethsemane story when he narrates the story of the arrest. And the reason why I think that's quite a telling example is that John doesn't usually use that language of cup as a to talk about martyrdom. So yes, again, there, really interesting case of the way that John presupposes the synoptics.
And what do you make of John saying that the Word manifested in flesh? How is it countering Matthew, or using Matthew, Mark, and Luke and altering what they're saying by adding this language?
Are we thinking like John 1:14, the sort of Word becoming flesh?
Yes.
That stuff. Yeah. I mean, the thing. Well, one of the things that I find interesting about John 1:14 is that everybody knows the line, "The Word became flesh," but the bit which people don't dwell on enough, and this is something Ernst Käsemann said many years ago, is the second part, which talks about him tabernacling amongst us, pitching his tent with us. That's a really, really interesting thing. And I think what's happening there in John 1:14 is that the gospel is actually building on the transfiguration story. So you have transfiguration story in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but John is particularly close to Luke there, because one of the things that happens in the Lucan version only is that Peter, James, and John saw Jesus's glory. And so what's happening here in John's gospel is that he's taken that idea of them seeing Jesus's glory and he's put it into the sort of the narrator's speech here, we beheld his glory. And the people that are beholding the glory in Luke's gospel are Peter, James, and John. And I think that is a strong hint that John's gospel is placing its author at the Mount of Transfiguration. That I actually only realized how important that was when I went to listen to a paper by Dale Allison, and he made that point very strongly. And so I reference him in the book at that point. But I think it's quite striking, frequently missed by people. We beheld his glory, and it's in a context where you've got tabernacling, we've got Jesus described as this Son of God. I mean, it really is. It's just bathed in language from the Transfiguration story, I think.
So we have a super chat question from Adia Morgenstern. Thank you for your super chat. Is there potentially a contemporary conversation going on between the authors of the Gospel of John and the Gospel of Thomas?
It's a great question, and it's one that I've grappled with myself for a long time. The strength of this hypothesis, and Elaine Pagels wrote a bit about this as well. The strength of the hypothesis is that Thomas does become a character in John's Gospel, and becomes quite a prominent character in John's Gospel, and he tends to appear in contexts where Jesus' death and resurrection is in view. And then right at the end of the Gospel, in John 20, the famous story of doubting Thomas, he says, "My Lord and my God." He says that at the moment when Jesus has appeared, raised from the dead, bearing the wounds of the crucifixion. So you get in that one incident, character of Thomas, Jesus crucified and resurrected, and Jesus is my Lord and my God. Now, what's so fascinating about that is you read the Gospel of Thomas, no crucifixion, no resurrection. Jesus is never described as Lord or God. And it's one of those things where the contrast is so strong that you almost think, well, has John deliberately picked that disciple to polemicize against because of the Gospel of Thomas? For a long time, I toyed with that, tried to get it, but the problem is I couldn't get it to work with the dates. Like, because Gospel of Thomas seems clearly to me to be from beyond 135. And also, if it's a polemic against Thomas, it's not a very good one, because you end up kind of having Thomas as a hero. And, you know, if you visit India and go and look at all the churches that are constructed in Thomas's honor, and you have this line, "My Lord and my God," written across lots and lots of them, then so I think it's possible that you've already got a Thomasine community and a kind of a Thomasine Christianity that John is kind of trying to sort of move around. It could also be that the Gospel of Thomas chose Thomas as its character to polemicize against John. I mean, it could easily be something like that, but it is an enduring mystery. So I'm grateful to the questioner for bringing that one up.
And what do you make of John's treatment of, she said to him, "Yes, Lord," and that regarding the Messiah, Son of God?
I'm trying to think what the reference is
That's
there.
in John 11:27.
Okay, so it's where raising Lazarus and
The entire
Martha and Mary.
Yeah, the entire verse says, she said to him, "Yes, Lord,
Got it.
I believe that you are the Messiah, Son of God,
Right.
the one coming into
Yes.
the world."
Yeah. Yes, that's right. It's the bit I was talking about earlier on. Yeah, it's fun as well. I mean, not only so you get Messiah and Son of God. That is, see, one of the things that I think people get wrong about John's Christology is they so focus on where John is different from the synoptics that they miss where he's the same. So they always focus on the "I am" sayings. They make those really, really important. And they also talk about the prologue, the whole idea of the Word becoming flesh, which we we're just talking about. But when John is summing things up at the end, the terms that he uses are Christ, Son of God. Christ and the Son of God. And at the confession, which happens like at the midpoint of John's Gospel, 11:27, as you say, you get Messiah, Son of God. And actually, it turns out that that's the fundamental to John's Christology, him as the Messiah and the Son of God. And that is something which is revealed through reflection on the resurrection, which is why it comes in the context of the raising of Lazarus and then comes again right at the end of the gospel once you've had the resurrection story narrated.
What do you make of the I am the bread of life in John, and also I am the light of the world?
Well, I'm the bread of life is a fascinating one, because that's the first of the I am sayings in John. And it comes straight after the feeding of the 5,000. And as I was mentioning earlier, I think that there's a reason for that. I think that quite cleverly what John is doing is introducing the idea of bread, the metaphor of bread, and then making it Jesus. So it develops out of that story. But also it does something kind of clever in that this is one of the few places in the synoptics where you get an I am saying, because in Mark's gospel, in Mark 6, in exactly the same spot, the walking on the sea, Jesus says, I am, ego eimi in Greek. And so John actually uses that Markinism to prepare for this first of his I am sayings, I am the bread of life. So you get this I am, and then you get I am the bread of life. Light of the world is a fascinating one as well, because that expression, light of the world, it's the first time it ever occurs in Greek literature, according to our friend TLG, which I was mentioning earlier on. The first time it ever occurs in Greek literature is in Matthew's gospel. And Jesus says to the disciples, "You are the light of the world." And John likes that expression, but he switches around and makes it Jesus saying it. So Jesus is the light of the world. So that's another nice Johannine Matthean link. Like I said, John always close to Matthew when it comes to Christology. It's really interesting.
And there's another parallel between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I want to ask you about here in relation to John about the I will not drink from now on the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes.
Yes, because in John 15, you get the I am saying, I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. Now, it's so striking that you get this language of Jesus being the vine in the very context where you get the vine mentioned in Luke's gospel about not drinking from the fruit of the vine again. So it's not just a parallel in terminology, but a precise contextual parallel as well. And of course, the synoptics are all about stories of vineyards and wine and so on. So it's such a clear image for John to bring out in his gospel.
And Jesus walking on the sea in John 6 in relation to Matthew 14 and Mark 6.
Yeah, I mean, I think there it's that story. It's one of the places where John is closest to Mark's gospel, to some extent Matthew as well. Do not fear, I am. It's very, very close. And yes, I think this is one of the things that actually inspired John to come up with these I am sayings of Jesus. I think he saw that I am saying in Mark and developed it in his own special way.
And what do you make of Matthew 11:25-27, Luke 10:21-22 in light of the Johannine thunderbolt?
Yeah, our old friend, the Johannine Thunderbolt. Yeah. So I have to thank my friend Paul Anderson here, because some years ago, his John Jesus and History project were doing a session about parallels between John and Q, and he knew that I didn't accept the Q hypothesis. So he said, well, could we have you for an alternative perspective? And I thought, well, it'd be fun to do this. I mean, is there anything sensible I could say? Well, the thing that, of course, I went to thinking about straight away is that passage with the so-called Johannine thunderbolt, because it's one of the areas where Matthew and Luke are most close in wording. So it has to be from Q and not from anywhere else if you believe in Q, which I don't. And the thing that's so striking about it is it looks just like a bit of John's gospel. So what's this bit of John's gospel doing turning up in Q and in Matthew and Luke? So I took a careful look at it, and do you know what? I think it's just driven through with Matthew's theology. Matthew loves this kind of father-son Christology. I said John's always closest to Matthew when it's Christology. So he's got all this father-son kind of material. And the way that Jesus speaks in the Johannine Thunderbolt is actually quite characteristic of Matthew's Jesus. All authority on heaven and earth has been given to me is a phrase that you get elsewhere in Matthew. So what I think, so I argue in the book, I developed it out of the paper that I presented all those years ago in the John, Jesus and History project. But I thought, do you know what it is? I don't think this is like a thunderbolt at all. This isn't like a Johannine thunderbolt where the imagery should warn us that something's wrong here. What it actually is, it's like a kind of synoptic platform that John is using to launch his Christological rocket. Like, he builds on the Matthean Christology and develops it. So that's really what that material is doing. In a way, it's one of the biggest challenges in the book. I'm interested to see how people respond to it. Practically everything in the book I did try out, either at a conference paper or in a invited lecture of some kind, or with my friends and colleagues here at Duke. So I did a whole bunch of trying things out, and that was one of the ones that nearly didn't go in the book because I just wasn't sure if people would buy it. But I'm convinced by it, and it's towards the end of the book as well. So hopefully people still will buy it.
And for my final question, what do you make of John's resurrection narrative in contrast to Matthew, Mark, and Luke?
That's a great question, because it's a big one. I'll tell you one thing. I think it's one of the parts of John that I've read more than anything else in the gospel, because there's something very clever about John's resurrection story. It really evokes the synoptic narratives without being very close to them in terms of verbatim agreement. It's almost like someone has meditated on those stories for a while, and he wants the reader to feel that you're still in that world. He wants you to be in this. It's got to be recognizable as the same world of Mark 16, Matthew 28, Luke 24. But equally, he doesn't just want to recreate those stories just by tweaking a few details. He wants to do something fresh. And so I think by homing in on Mary Magdalene and Thomas, and then in chapter 21 on Peter and the beloved disciple, he achieves something, I think, which is quite clever, which is he writes a synoptic-like narrative that nevertheless builds on the synoptic gospel. So yeah, it's I did go back to those more than almost anything else. And of course, there's one controversy there as well, which is that a lot of people think John 21 was added to the gospel at a later time. And I'm not persuaded that that's the case. 21 seems to integrate so well into the gospel that I'm not persuaded by that thesis. So, but I did spend a long time going backwards and forwards on it, but I'm pretty sure that it should be seen as part of the gospel.
And like I said earlier, I'll have the link to Mark Goodacre's new book in the description below and the pinned comments if you want to pre-order it or purchase it. If you're watching this when the book comes out, you can do so. And also the link to Mark's YouTube channel in the description below, tagged, and also in the pinned comment. And that being said, Mark, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Jacob. Always a pleasure.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.